The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. Many of the words here have a modern ring. One would not readily attribute them to an Oriental despot, 2100 B.C., or suspect that the laws that they introduced were based upon Sumerian prototypes, now 6,000 years old. This ancient origin, combined with Babylonian circumstance, to give the code a composite and heterogeneous character. It begins with compliments to the gods, but takes no further notice of them in its astonishingly secular legislation. It mingles the most enlightened laws with the most barbarous punishments, and sets the primitive lex talionis and trial by ordeal alongside elaborate judicial procedures and a discriminating attempt to limit marital tyranny. All in all, these 285 laws, arranged almost scientifically under the headings of personal property, real estate, trade and business, the family, injuries, and labor, form a code more advanced and civilized than that of Assyria 1,000 and more years later, and in many respects as good as that of a modern European state. The Mosaic Code apparently borrows from it, or derives with it from a common original. The habit of stamping a legal contract with an official seal goes back to Hammurabi. There are few words finer in the history of law than those with which the great Babylonian brings his legislation to a close. The righteous laws which Hammurabi, the wise king, established, and by which he gave the land stable support and pure government. I am the guardian governor. In my bosom I carried the people of the land of Sumer and Akkad. In my wisdom I restrained them, that the strong might not oppress the weak, and that they should give justice to the orphan and the widow. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come before my image as king of righteousness. Let him read the inscription on my monument. Let him give heed to my weighty words. And may my monument enlighten him as to his cause, and may he understand his case. May he set his heart at ease, exclaiming, Hammurabi indeed is a ruler who is like a real father to his people. He has established prosperity for his people for all time, and given a pure government to the land. In the days that are yet to come, for all future time, may the king who is in the land observe the words of righteousness which I have written upon my monument. This unifying legislation was but one of Hammurabi's accomplishments. At his command, a great canal was dug between Kish and the Persian Gulf, thereby irrigating a large area of land and protecting the cities of the south from the destructive floods which the Tigris had been wont to visit upon them. In another inscription, which has found its devious way from his time to ours, he tells us proudly how he gave water, that noble and unappreciated commonplace which was once a luxury, security and government to many tribes. Even through the boasting, an honest mannerism of the Orient, we hear the voice of statesmanship. When Anu and Enlil, the gods of Uruk and Nippur, gave me the lands of Sumer and Akkad to rule, and they entrusted this scepter to me, I dug the canal Hammurabi Nukushnishi, Hammurabi the abundance of the people, which bringeth copious water to the land of Sumer and Akkad. Its banks on both sides I turned into cultivated ground. I heaped up piles of grain. I provided unfailing water for the lands. The scattered people I gathered. With pasturage and water I provided them. I pastured them with abundance and settled them in peaceful dwellings. Despite the secular quality of his laws, Hammurabi was clever enough to gild his authority with the approval of the gods. He built temples as well as forts, and coddled the clergy by constructing at Babylon a gigantic sanctuary for Marduk and his wife, the national deities, and a massive granary to store up wheat for gods and priests. These and similar gifts were an astute investment from which he expected steady returns in the awed obedience of the people. From their taxes he financed the forces of law and order, and had enough left over to beautify his capital. Palaces and temples rose on every hand. A bridge spanned the Euphrates to let the city spread itself along both banks. Ships manned with 90 men plied up and down the river. 2,000 years before Christ, Babylon was already one of the richest cities that history had yet known. The people were of Semitic appearance, dark in hair and features, masculinely bearded for the most part, and occasionally bewigged. Both sexes wore the hair long. Sometimes even the men dangled curls. Frequently the men, as well as the women, disguised themselves with perfumes. The common dress for both sexes was a white linen tunic reaching to the feet. In the women it left one shoulder bare, in the men it was augmented with mantle and robe. As wealth grew, the people developed a taste for color and dyed for themselves garments of blue on red or red on blue, in stripes, circles, checks, or dots. The bare feet of the Sumerian period gave way to shapely sandals, and the male head in Hammurabi's time was swathed in turbans. The women wore necklaces, bracelets, and amulets, and strings of beads in their carefully coiffured hair. The men flourished walking sticks with carved heads, and carried on their girdles the prettily designed seals with which they attested their letters and documents. The priests wore tall conical caps to conceal their humanity. It is almost a law of history that the same wealth that generates a civilization announces its decay. For wealth produces ease as well as art. It softens a people to the ways of luxury and peace, and invites invasion from stronger arms and hungrier mouths. On the eastern boundary of the new state, a hardy tribe of mountaineers, the Kassites, looked with envy upon the riches of Babylon. 8 years after Hammurabi's death, they inundated the land, plundered it, retreated, raided it again and again, and finally settled down in it as conquerors and rulers. This is the normal origin of aristocracies. They were of non-Semitic stock, perhaps descendants of European immigrants from Neolithic days. Their victory over Semitic Babylon represented one more swing of the racial pendulum in Western Asia. For several centuries, Babylonia lived in an ethnic and political chaos that put a stop to the development of science and art. We have a kaleidoscope of this stifling disorder in the Amarna letters, in which the kinglets of Babylonia and Syria, having sent modest tribute to imperial Egypt after the victories of Thutmose III, beg for aid against rebels and invaders, and quarrel about the value of the gifts that they exchange with the disdainful Amenhotep III and the absorbed and negligent Ikhnaton. The Kassites were expelled after almost 6 centuries of rule as disruptive as the similar sway of the Hyksos in Egypt. The disorder continued for 400 years more under obscure Babylonian rulers, whose polysyllabic roster might serve as an obligato to Gray's elegy, until the rising power of Assyria in the north stretched down its hand and brought Babylonia under the kings of Nineveh. When Babylon rebelled, Sennacherib destroyed it almost completely, but the genial despotism of Esarhaddon restored it to prosperity and culture. The rise of the Medes weakened Assyria, and with their help, Nabopolassar liberated Babylonia, set up an independent dynasty, and, dying, bequeathed this second Babylonian kingdom to his son, Nebuchadrezzar II, villain of the vengeful and legendary Book of Daniel. Nebuchadrezzar's inaugural address to Marduk, god-in-chief of Babylon, reveals a glimpse of an Oriental monarch's aims and character. As my precious life do I love thy sublime appearance. Outside of my city Babylon, I have not selected among all settlements any dwelling. At thy command, O merciful Marduk, may the house that I have built endure forever. May I be satiated with its splendor, attain old age therein, with abundant offspring, and receive therein tribute of the kings of all regions, from all mankind. He lived almost up to his hopes, for though illiterate and not unquestionably sane, he became the most powerful ruler of his time in the Near East, and the greatest warrior, statesman, and builder in all the succession of Babylonian kings after Hammurabi himself. When Egypt conspired with Assyria to reduce Babylonia to vassalage again, Nebuchadrezzar met the Egyptian hosts at Carchemish, on the upper reaches of the Euphrates, and almost annihilated them. Palestine and Syria then fell easily under his sway, and Babylonian merchants controlled all the trade that flowed across western Asia from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Nebuchadrezzar spent the tolls of this trade, the tributes of these subjects, and the taxes of his people, in beautifying his capital and assuaging the hunger of the priests. Is not this the great Babylon that I built? He resisted the temptation to be merely a conqueror. He sallied forth occasionally to teach his subjects the virtues of submission, but for the most part he stayed at home, making Babylon the unrivaled capital of the Near East, the largest and most magnificent metropolis of the ancient world. Nabopolassar had laid plans for the reconstruction of the city. Nebuchadrezzar used his long reign of 43 years to carry them to completion. Herodotus, who saw Babylon a century and a half later, described it as standing in a spacious plain and surrounded by a wall 56 miles in length, so broad that a 4-horse chariot could be driven along the top, and enclosing an area of some 200 square miles. Probably this included not only the city proper, but a large agricultural hinterland within the walls, designed to provide the teeming metropolis with sustenance in time of siege. Through the center of the town ran the palm-fringed Euphrates, busy with commerce and spanned by a handsome bridge. If we may trust Diodorus Siculus, a tunnel 15 feet wide and 12 feet high connected the two banks. Practically all the better buildings were of brick, for stone was rare in Mesopotamia, but the bricks were often faced with enameled tiles of brilliant blue, yellow, or white, adorned with animal and other figures in glazed relief, which remain to this day supreme in their kind. Nearly all the bricks so far recovered from the site of Babylon bear the proud inscription, "I am Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon." Approaching the city, the traveler saw first, at the crown of a very mountain of masonry, an immense and lofty ziggurat, rising in 7 stages of gleaming enamel to a height of 650 feet, crowned with a shrine containing a massive table of solid gold, and an ornate bed on which each night some woman slept to await the pleasure of the god. This structure, taller than the pyramids of Egypt and surpassing in height all but the latest of modern buildings, was probably the Tower of Babel of Hebraic myth, the many-storied audacity of a people who did not know Yahweh, and whom the god of hosts was supposed to have confounded with a multiplicity of tongues. Babel, however, does not mean confusion or babble, as the legend supposes. As used in the word Babylon, it meant the gate of God. South of the ziggurat stood the gigantic temple of Marduk, tutelary deity of Babylon. Around and below this temple, the city spread itself out in a few wide and brilliant avenues, crossed by crowded canals and narrow winding streets, alive, no doubt, with traffic and bazaars, and orientally odorous with garbage and humanity. Connecting the temples was a spacious sacred way, paved with asphalt-covered bricks overlaid with flags of limestone and red breccia. Over this the gods might pass without muddying their feet. This broad avenue was flanked with walls of colored tile, on which stood out in low relief 120 brightly enameled lions, snarling to keep the impious away. At one end of the sacred way rose the magnificent Ishtar Gate, a massive double portal of resplendent tiles, adorned with enameled flowers and animals of admirable color, vitality, and line. 600 yards north of the Tower of Babel rose a mound called Kasser, on which Nebuchadrezzar built the most imposing of his palaces. At its center stood his principal dwelling place, the walls of finely made yellow brick, the floors of white and mottled sandstone. Reliefs of vivid blue glaze adorned the surfaces, and gigantic basalt lions guarded the entrance. Nearby, supported on a succession of superimposed circular colonnades, were the famous hanging gardens, which the Greeks included among the 7 wonders of the world. The gallant Nebuchadrezzar had built them for one of his wives, the daughter of Cyaxares, king of the Medes. This princess, unaccustomed to the hot sun and dust of Babylon, pined for the verdure of her native hills. The topmost terrace was covered with rich soil to the depth of many feet, providing space and nourishment not merely for varied flowers and plants, but for the largest and most deep-rooted trees. Hydraulic engines, concealed in the columns and manned by shifts of slaves, carried water from the Euphrates to the highest tier of the gardens. Here, 75 feet above the ground, in the cool shade of tall trees and surrounded by exotic shrubs and fragrant flowers, the ladies of the royal harem walked unveiled, secure from the common eye, while on the plains and streets below, the common man and woman plowed, wove, built, carried burdens, and reproduced their kind. 2. The toilers. Hunting, tillage, food, industry, transport, the perils of commerce, moneylenders, slaves. Part of the country was still wild and dangerous. Snakes wandered in the thick grass, and the kings of Babylonia and Assyria made it their royal sport to hunt in hand-to-hand conflict the lions that prowled in the woods, posed placidly for artists, but fled timidly at the nearer approach of men. Civilization is an occasional and temporary interruption of the jungle. Most of the soil was tilled by tenants or by slaves, some of it by peasant proprietors. In the earlier centuries, the ground was broken up with stone hoes, as in Neolithic tillage. A seal dating some 1400 B.C. is our earliest representation of the plow in Babylonia. Probably, this ancient and honorable tool had already a long history behind it in the land between the rivers, and yet it was modern enough, for though it was drawn by oxen in the manner of our fathers, it had, attached to the plow as in Sumeria, a tube through which the seed was sown in the manner of our children. The waters of the rising rivers were not allowed to flood the land as in Egypt. On the contrary, every farm was protected from the inundation by ridges of earth, some of which can still be seen today. The overflow was guided into a complex network of canals, or stored into reservoirs, from which it was sluiced into the fields as needed, or raised over the ridges by shadoufs, buckets lifted and lowered on a pivoted and revolving pole. Nebuchadrezzar distinguished his reign by building many canals, and gathering the surplus waters of the overflow into a reservoir 140 miles in circumference, which nourished by its outlets vast areas of land. Ruins of these canals can be seen in Mesopotamia today, and, as if further to bind the quick and the dead, the primitive shaduf is still used in the valleys of the Euphrates and the Loire. So watered, the land produced a variety of cereals and pulses, great orchards of fruits and nuts, and above all the date. From this beneficent concoction of sun and soil, the Babylonians made bread, honey, cake, and other delicacies. They mixed it with meal to make one of their most sustaining foods, and to encourage its reproduction they shook the flowers of the male palm over those of the female. From Mesopotamia, the grape and the olive were introduced into Greece and Rome, and thence into Western Europe. From nearby Persia came the peach, and from the shores of the Black Sea, Lucullus brought the cherry tree to Rome. Milk, so rare in the distant Orient, now became one of the staple foods of the Near East. Meat was rare and costly, but fish from the great streams found their way into the poorest mouths. And in the evening, when the peasant might have been disturbed by thoughts on life and death, he quieted memory and anticipation with wine pressed from the date, or beer brewed from the corn. Meanwhile others pried into the earth, struck oil, and mined copper, lead, iron, silver, and gold. Strabo tells how what he calls naphtha, or liquid asphalt, was taken from the soil of Mesopotamia then as now, and how Alexander, hearing that this was a kind of water that burned, tested the report incredulously by covering a boy with the strange fluid and igniting him with a torch. Tools, which had still been of stone in the days of Hammurabi, began at the turn of the last millennium before Christ to be made of bronze, then of iron, and the art of casting metal appeared. Textiles were woven of cotton and wool, stuffs were dyed and embroidered with such skill that these tissues became one of the most valued exports of Babylonia, praised to the skies by the writers of Greece and Rome. As far back as we can go in Mesopotamian history, we find the weaver's loom and the potter's wheel. These were almost the only machines. Buildings were mostly of adobe, clay mixed with straw, or bricks still soft and moist, were placed one upon the other and allowed to dry into a solid wall cemented by the sun. It was observed that the bricks in the fireplace became harder and more durable than those that the sun had baked. The process of hardening them in kilns was then a natural development, and thenceforth there was no end to the making of bricks in Babylon. Trades multiplied and became diversified and skilled, and as early as Hammurabi, industry was organized into guilds, called tribes of masters and apprentices. Local transport used wheeled carts drawn by patient asses. The horse is first mentioned in Babylonian records about 2100 B.C. as the ass from the east. Apparently it came from the tablelands of Central Asia, conquered Babylonia with the Kassites, and reached Egypt with the Hyksos. With this new means of locomotion and carriage, trade expanded from local to foreign commerce. Babylon grew wealthy as the commercial hub of the Near East, and the nations of the ancient Mediterranean world were drawn into closer contact for good and ill. Nebuchadrezzar facilitated trade by improving the highways. "I have turned inaccessible tracks," he reminds the historian, "into serviceable roads." Countless caravans brought to the bazaars and shops of Babylon the products of half the world. From India, they came via Kabul, Herat, and Ecbatana. From Egypt via Pelusium and Palestine. From Asia Minor through Tyre, Sidon, and Sardis to Carchemish, and then down the Euphrates. As a result of all this trade, Babylon became, under Nebuchadrezzar, a thriving and noisy marketplace from which the wealthy sought refuge in residential suburbs. Note the contemporary ring of a rich suburbanite's letter to King Cyrus of Persia, circa 539 B.C. "Our estate seemed to me the finest in the world, for it was so near to Babylon that we enjoyed all the advantages of a great city, and yet could come back home and be rid of all its rush and worry." Government in Mesopotamia never succeeded in establishing such economic order as that which the pharaohs achieved in Egypt. Commerce was harassed with a multiplicity of dangers and tolls. The merchant did not know which to fear the more, the robbers that might beset him on the way, or the towns and baronies that exacted heavy fees from him for the privilege of using their roads. It was safer, where possible, to take the great national highway, the Euphrates, which Nebuchadrezzar had made navigable from the Persian Gulf to Thapsacus. His campaigns in Arabia and his subjugation of Tyre opened up to Babylonian commerce the Indian and Mediterranean seas, but these opportunities were only partially explored. For on the open sea, as in the mountain passes and the desert wastes, perils beset the merchant at every hour. Vessels were large, but reefs were many and treacherous, Navigation was not yet a science, and at any moment pirates or the ambitious dwellers on the shore might board the ships, appropriate the merchandise, and enslave or kill the crew. The merchants reimbursed themselves for such losses by restricting their honesty to the necessities of each situation. These difficult transactions were made easier by a well-developed system of finance. The Babylonians had no coinage, but even before Hammurabi they used, besides barley and corn, ingots of gold and silver as standards of value and mediums of exchange. The metal was unstamped and was weighed at each transaction. The smallest unit of currency was the shekel, a half-ounce of silver worth from $2.50 to $5 of our contemporary currency. 60 such shekels made a mina, and 60 minas made a talent, from $10,000 to $20,000. Loans were made in goods or currency, but at a high rate of interest, fixed by the state at 20% per annum for loans of money and 33% for loans in kind. Even these rates were exceeded by lenders who could hire clever scribes to circumvent the law. There were no banks, but certain powerful families carried on from generation to generation the business of lending money. They dealt also in real estate and financed industrial enterprises, and persons who had funds on deposit with such men could pay their obligations by written drafts. The priests also made loans, particularly to finance the sowing and reaping of the crops. The law occasionally took the side of the debtor. For example, if a peasant mortgaged his farm and through storm or drought or other act of God had no harvest from his toil, then no interest could be exacted from him in that year. But for the most part the law was written with an eye to protecting property and preventing losses. It was a principle of Babylonian law that no man had a right to borrow money unless he wished to be held completely responsible for its repayment. Hence the creditor could seize the debtor's slave or son as hostage for an unpaid debt, and could hold him for not more than 3 years. A plague of usury was the price that Babylonian industry, like our own, paid for the fertilizing activity of a complex credit system. It was essentially a commercial civilization. Most of the documents that have come down from it are of a business character: sales, loans, contracts, partnerships, commissions, exchanges, bequests, agreements, promissory notes, and the like. We find in these tablets abundant evidence of wealth and a certain materialistic spirit that managed, like some later civilizations, to reconcile piety with greed. We see in the literature many signs of a busy and prosperous life, but we find also at every turn reminders of the slavery that underlies all cultures. The most interesting contracts of sale from the age of Nebuchadnezzar are those that have to do with slaves. They were recruited from captives taken in battle, from slave raids carried out upon foreign states by marauding Bedouins, and from the reproductive enthusiasm of the slaves themselves. Their value ranged from $20 to $65 for a woman, and from $50 to $100 for a man. Most of the physical work in the towns was done by them, including nearly all of the personal service. Female slaves were completely at the mercy of their purchaser, and were expected to provide him with bed as well as board. It was understood that he would breed through them a copious supply of children, and those slaves who were not so treated felt themselves neglected and dishonored. The slave and all his belongings were his master's property. He might be sold or pledged for debt. He might be put to death if his master thought him less lucrative alive than dead. If he ran away, no one could legally harbor him, and a reward was fixed for his capture. Like the free peasant, he was subject to conscription for both the army and the corvée, that is, for forced labor in such public works as cutting roads and digging canals. On the other hand, the slave's master paid his doctor's fees, and kept him moderately alive through illness, slack employment, and old age. He might marry a free woman, and his children by her would be free. Half his property in such a case went on his death to his family. He might be set up in business by his master and retain part of the profits, with which he might then buy his freedom, or his master might liberate him for exceptional or long and faithful service. But only a few slaves achieved such freedom. The rest consoled themselves with a high birth rate until they became more numerous than the free. A great slave class moved like a swelling subterranean river underneath the Babylonian state. 3. The law. The Code of Hammurabi, the powers of the king, trial by ordeal, lex talionis, forms of punishment, codes of wages and prices, state restoration of stolen goods. Such a society, of course, never dreamed of democracy. Its economic character necessitated a monarchy supported by commercial wealth or feudal privilege, and protected by the judicious distribution of legal violence. A landed aristocracy, gradually displaced by a commercial plutocracy, helped to maintain social control and served as intermediary between people and king. The latter passed his throne down to any son of his choosing, with the result that every son considered himself heir apparent, formed a clique of supporters, and, as like as not, raised a war of succession if his hopes were unfulfilled. Within the limits of this arbitrary rule, the government was carried on by central and local lords or administrators appointed by the king. These were advised and checked by provincial or municipal assemblies of elders or notables, who managed to maintain, even under Assyrian domination, a proud measure of local self-government. Every administrator, and usually the king himself, acknowledged the guidance and authority of that great body of law which had been given form under Hammurabi, and had maintained its substance, despite every change of circumstance and detail, through 15 centuries. The legal development was from supernatural to secular sanctions, from severity to lenience, and from physical to financial penalties. In the earlier days, an appeal to the gods was taken through trial by ordeal. A man accused of sorcery or a woman charged with adultery was invited to leap into the Euphrates, and the gods were on the side of the best swimmers. If the woman emerged alive, she was innocent. If the sorcerer was drowned, his accuser received his property. If he was not, he received the property of his accuser. The first judges were priests, and to the end of Babylonian history the courts were for the most part located in the temples. But already in the days of Hammurabi, secular courts responsible only to the government were replacing the judgment seats presided over by the clergy. Penology began with the lex talionis, or law of equivalent retaliation. If a man knocked out an eye or a tooth or broke a limb of a patrician, precisely the same was to be done to him. If a house collapsed and killed the purchaser, the architect or builder must die. If the accident killed the buyer's son, the son of the architect or builder must die. If a man struck a girl and killed her, not he but his daughter must suffer the penalty of death. Gradually, these punishments in kind were replaced by awards of damages. A payment of money was permitted as an alternative to the physical retaliation, and later the fine became the sole punishment. So the eye of the commoner might be knocked out for 60 shekels of silver, and the eye of a slave might be knocked out for 30. For the penalty varied not merely with the gravity of the offense, but with the rank of the offender and the victim. A member of the aristocracy was subject to severer penalties for the same crime than a man of the people, but an offense against such an aristocrat was a costly extravagance. A plebeian striking a plebeian was fined 10 shekels, or $50. To strike a person of title or property cost 6 times more. From such dissuasions, the law passed to barbarous punishments by amputation or death. A man who struck his father had his hands cut off. A physician whose patient died or lost an eye as the result of an operation had his fingers cut off. A nurse who knowingly substituted one child for another had to sacrifice her breasts. Death was decreed for a variety of crimes: rape, kidnapping, brigandage, burglary, incest, procurement of a husband's death by his wife in order to marry another man, the opening or entering of a wine shop by a priestess, the harboring of a fugitive slave, cowardice in the face of the enemy, malfeasance in office, careless or uneconomical housewifery, or malpractice in the selling of beer. In such rough ways, through thousands of years, these traditions and habits of order and self-restraint were established, which became part of the unconscious basis of civilization. Within certain limits, the state regulated prices, wages, and fees. What the surgeon might charge was established by law, and wages were fixed by the Code of Hammurabi for builders, brickmakers, tailors, stonemasons, carpenters, boatmen, herdsmen, and laborers. The law of inheritance made the man's children, rather than his wife, his natural and direct heirs. The widow received her dowry and her wedding gift and remained head of the household as long as she lived. There was no right of primogeniture. The sons inherited equally, and in this way the largest estates were soon redivided, and the concentration of wealth was in some measure checked. Private property in land and goods was taken for granted by the code. We find no evidence of lawyers in Babylonia, except for priests who might serve as notaries, and the scribe who would write for pay anything from a will to a madrigal. The plaintiff preferred his own plea, without the luxury of terminology. Litigation was discouraged. The very first law of the code reads with almost illegal simplicity, "If a man bring an accusation against a man and charge him with a capital crime but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death." There are signs of bribery and of tampering with witnesses. A court of appeals, staffed by the king's judges, sat at Babylon, and a final appeal might be carried to the king himself. There was nothing in the code about the rights of the individual against the state. That was to be a European innovation. But Articles 22 to 24 provided, if not political, at least economic protection. If a man practices brigandage and be captured, that man shall be put to death. If the brigand be not captured, the man who has been robbed shall, in the presence of the god, make an itemized statement of his loss, and the city and governor within whose province and jurisdiction the robbery was committed shall compensate him for whatever was lost. If it be a life that was lost, the city and governor shall pay 1 mina, $300, to the heirs. What modern city is so well governed that it would dare to offer such reimbursements to the victims of its negligence? Has the law progressed since Hammurabi, or only increased and multiplied? 4. The gods of Babylon. Religion and the state, the functions and powers of the clergy, the lesser gods, Marduk, Ishtar, the Babylonian stories of the creation and the flood, the love of Ishtar and Tammuz, the descent of Ishtar into hell, the death and resurrection of Tammuz, ritual and prayer, penitential psalms, sin, magic, superstition. The power of the king was limited not only by the law and the aristocracy, but by the clergy. Technically, the king was merely the agent of the city god. Taxation was in the name of the god and found its way directly or deviously into the temple treasuries. The king was not really king in the eyes of the people until he was invested with royal authority by the priests, took the hands of Bel, and conducted the image of Marduk in solemn procession through the streets. In these ceremonies, the monarch was dressed as a priest, symbolizing the union of church and state, and perhaps the priestly origin of the kingship. All the glamour of the supernatural hedged about the throne, and made rebellion a colossal impiety which risked not only the neck but the soul. Even the mighty Hammurabi received his laws from the god. From the Ptasis, or priest-governors of Sumeria, to the religious coronation of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonia remained in effect a theocratic state, always under the thumb of the priests. The wealth of the temples grew from generation to generation, as the uneasy rich shared their dividends with the gods. The kings, feeling an especial need of divine forgiveness, built the temples, equipped them with furniture, food, and slaves, deeded to them great areas of land, and assigned to them an annual income from the state. When the army won a battle, the first share of the captives and the spoils went to the temples. When any special good fortune befell the king, extraordinary gifts were dedicated to the gods. Certain lands were required to pay to the temples a yearly tribute of dates, corn, or fruit. If they failed, the temples could foreclose on them, and in this way the lands usually came into possession by the priests. Poor as well as rich turned over to the temples as much as they thought profitable of their earthly gains. Gold, silver, copper, lapis lazuli, gems, and precious woods accumulated in the sacred treasury. As the priests could not directly use or consume this wealth, they turned it into productive or investment capital, and became the greatest agriculturists, manufacturers, and financiers of the nation. Not only did they hold vast tracts of land, they owned a great number of slaves or controlled hundreds of laborers who were hired out to other employers or worked for the temples in their divers trades, from the playing of music to the brewing of beer. The priests were also the greatest merchants and financiers of Babylonia. They sold the varied products of the temple shops and handled a large proportion of the country's trade. They had a reputation for wise investment, and many persons entrusted their savings to them, confident of a modest but reliable return. They made loans on more lenient terms than the private moneylenders. Sometimes they lent to the sick or the poor without interest, merely asking a return of the principal when Marduk should smile upon the borrower again. Finally, they performed many legal functions. They served as notaries, attesting and signing contracts and making wills. They heard and decided suits and trials, kept official records, and recorded commercial transactions. Occasionally, the king commandeered some of the temple accumulations to meet an expensive emergency, but this was rare and dangerous, for the priests had laid terrible curses upon all who should touch unpermitted the smallest jot of ecclesiastical property. Besides, their influence with the people was ultimately greater than that of the king, and they might in most cases depose him if they set their combined wits and powers to this end. They had also the advantage of permanence. The king died, but the god lived on. The council of priests, free from the fortunes of elections, illnesses, assassinations, and wars, had a corporate perpetuity that made possible long-term and patient policies, such as characterize great religious organizations to this day. The supremacy of the priests under these conditions was inevitable. It was fated that the merchants should make Babylon, and that the priests should enjoy it. Who were the gods that formed the invisible constabulary of the state? They were numerous, for the imagination of the people was limitless, and there was hardly any end to the needs that deities might serve. An official census of the gods, undertaken in the 9th century before Christ, counted them as some 65,000. Every town had its tutelary divinity, and as in our own time and faith, localities and villages, after making formal acknowledgment of the Supreme Being, worship specific minor gods with a special devotion, so Larsa lavished its temples on Shamash, Uruk on Ishtar, Ur on Nanar. For the Sumerian pantheon had survived the Sumerian state. The gods were not aloof from men. Most of them lived on earth in the temples, ate with a hearty appetite, and through nocturnal visits to pious women gave unexpected children to the busy citizens of Babylon. Oldest of all were the astronomic gods. Anu, the immovable firmament, Shamash, the sun, Nanar, the moon, and Bel, or Baal, the earth into whose bosom all Babylonians returned after death. Every family had household gods to whom prayers were said and libations poured each morning and night. Every individual had a protective divinity, or as we should say a guardian angel, to keep him from harm and joy, and genii of fertility hovered beneficently over the fields. It was probably out of this multitude of spirits that the Jews molded their cherubim. We do not find among the Babylonians such signs of monotheism as appear in Ikhnaton and the second Isaiah. Two forces, however, brought them near to it. The enlargement of the state by conquest and growth brought local deities under the supremacy of a single god, and several of the cities patriotically conferred omnipotence upon their favored divinities. "Trust in Nebo," says Nebo, "trust in no other god." This is not unlike the first of the commandments given to the Jews. Gradually, the number of the gods was lessened by interpreting the minor ones as forms or attributes of the major deities. In these ways, the god of Babylon, Marduk, originally a sun god, became sovereign of all Babylonian divinities. Hence his title, Bel-Marduk, that is, Marduk the god. To him and to Ishtar the Babylonians sent up the most eloquent of their prayers. Ishtar, Astarte to the Greeks, Ashtoreth to the Jews, interests us not only as analogue of the Egyptian Isis and prototype of the Grecian Aphrodite and the Roman Venus, but as the formal beneficiary of one of the strangest of Babylonian customs. She was Demeter as well as Aphrodite, no mere goddess of physical beauty and love, but the gracious divinity of bounteous motherhood, the secret inspiration of the growing soil, and the creative principle everywhere. It is impossible to find much harmony from a modern point of view in the attributes and functions of Ishtar. She was the goddess of war as well as of love, of prostitutes as well as of mothers. She called herself a compassionate courtesan. She was represented sometimes as a bearded bisexual deity, sometimes as a nude female offering her breasts to suck. And though her worshippers repeatedly addressed her as the Virgin, the Holy Virgin, and the Virgin Mother, this merely meant that her amours were free from all taint of wedlock. Gilgamesh rejected her advances on the ground that she could not be trusted. Had she not once loved, seduced, and then slain a lion? It is clear that we must put our own moral code to one side if we are to understand her. Note with what fervor the Babylonians could lift up to her throne litanies of laudation, only less splendid than those which a tender piety once raised to the Mother of God. I beseech thee, Lady of ladies, Goddess of goddesses, Ishtar, Queen of all cities, Leader of all men. Thou art the light of the world, thou art the light of heaven, mighty daughter of Sin, the moon god. Supreme is thy might, O Lady, exalted art thou above all gods. Thou renderest judgment, and thy decision is righteous. Unto thee are subject the laws of the earth and the laws of heaven, the laws of the temples and the shrines, the laws of the private apartment and the secret chamber. Where is the place where thy name is not, and where is the spot where thy commandments are not known? At thy name the earth and the heavens shake, and the gods they tremble. Thou lookest upon the oppressed, and to the downtrodden thou bringest justice every day. How long, Queen of heaven and earth? How long, shepherdess of pale-faced men, wilt thou tarry? How long, O Queen, whose feet are not weary, and whose knees make haste? How long, Lady of hosts, Lady of battles? Glorious one, whom all the spirits of heaven fear, who subduest all angry gods, mighty above all rulers, who holdest the reins of kings, opener of the womb of all women, great is thy light. Shining light of heaven, light of the world, enlightener of all the places where men dwell, who gatherest together the hosts of the nations. Goddess of men, divinity of women, thy counsel passeth understanding. Where thou glancest, the dead come to life, and the sick rise and walk. The mind of the diseased is healed when it looks upon thy face. How long, O lady, shall mine enemy triumph over me? Command, and at thy command the angry god will turn back. Ishtar is great, Ishtar is queen. My lady is exalted, my lady is queen. Inini, the mighty daughter of sin. There is none like unto her. With these gods as dramatis personae, the Babylonians constructed myths which have in large measure come down to us through the Jews as part of our own religious lore. There was, first of all, the myth of the creation. In the beginning was chaos. In the time when nothing which was called heaven existed above, and when nothing below had yet received the name of earth, Apsu, the ocean, who first was their father, and Tiamat, chaos, who gave birth to them all, mingled their waters in one. Things slowly began to grow and take form, but suddenly the monster goddess Tiamat set out to destroy all the other gods, and to make herself, chaos, supreme. A mighty revolution ensued in which all order was destroyed. Then another god, Marduk, slew Tiamat with her own medicine by casting a hurricane of wind into her mouth as she opened it to swallow him. Then he thrust his lance into Tiamat's wind-swollen paunch, and the goddess of chaos blew up. Marduk, recovering his calm, says the legend, split the dead Tiamat into 2 longitudinal halves, as one does a fish for drying. Then he hung up one of the halves on high, which became the heavens. The other half he spread out under his feet to form the earth. This is as much as we yet know about creation. Perhaps the ancient poet meant to suggest that the only creation of which we can know anything is the replacement of chaos with order, for in the end this is the essence of art and civilization. We should remember, however, that the defeat of chaos is only a myth. The Babylonian story of creation consists of 7 tablets, one for each day of creation, found in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Kuyunjik, Nineveh, in 1854. They are a copy of a legend that came down to Babylonia and Assyria from Sumeria. Having moved heaven and earth into place, Marduk undertook to knead earth with his blood and thereby make men for the service of the gods. Mesopotamian legends differed on the precise way in which this was done. They agreed in general that man was fashioned by the deity from a lump of clay. Usually, they represented him as living at first not in a paradise, but in bestial simplicity and ignorance, until a strange monster called Oannes, half fish and half philosopher, taught him the arts and sciences, the rules for founding cities and the principles of law, after which Oannes plunged into the sea and wrote a book on the history of civilization. Presently, however, the gods became dissatisfied with the men whom they had created, and sent a great flood to destroy them and all their works. The god of wisdom, Ea, took pity on mankind and resolved to save one man at least, Shamash-Napishtim, and his wife. The flood raged. Men encumbered the sea like fishes spawn. Then suddenly the gods wept and gnashed their teeth at their own folly, asking themselves, "Who will make the accustomed offerings now?" But Shamash-Napishtim had built an ark, had survived the flood, had perched on the mount of Nisir, and had sent out a reconnoitering dove. Now he decided to sacrifice to the gods, who accepted his gifts with surprise and gratitude. The gods snuffed up the odor, the gods snuffed up the excellent odor, the gods gathered like flies above the offering. Lovelier than this vague memory of some catastrophic inundation is the vegetation myth of Ishtar and Tammuz. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.